Good evening, fellow Toastmasters. I'm just going to dive right back into religion, politics, sex, the whole ball wax wrapped up into one, and speak to you on another one of my passions tonight, and that is freedom of choice. I am a woman who has lived through the entire panorama of the development of a woman's right to choose what she does with her reproductive choices. When I was a teenager, when a young girl, when I was growing up, there was really not much of an option open to someone who found themselves pregnant and unmarried. There was the Florence Crittenton home in Quad Cities. You could go there and hide out and have your baby and give it up for adoption, or take it home and live a life of shame, labeled as some kind of slut who had been whoring around, because if you were an unwed mother, that was what people thought of you back then. Then there were also back alley abortionists. These were people who had no medical training but had developed a system for using some kind of an appliance to give a young girl an abortion. And it was a very, very risky business. There was many a woman who died undergoing such a procedure. And when I use the term coat hanger abortion, I am being dead serious, because that was what got used. And then there were doctors. If you were a little bit higher echelon, if you had a connection, you could sometimes find a doctor who would sneak you in, pretend that you had an appendectomy or a tonsillectomy or whatever, and they would take care of the issue for you. This was really not a very satisfactory situation, because in spite of what might have been the trend of thinking at the time, there are a lot of reasons why someone might wind up pregnant but not wanting to carry the pregnancy to term. It's not always just simply a matter of living a loose life, and nobody ever takes into account the other half of the equation. There has to be a sperm donor, but we don't hear about them having to go live in secret for 9 months while their baby is being grown and delivered and then given up for adoption. We don't make the male half of that equation undergo the same shames or penalties. So there's not a lot of justice there. When Roe v. Wade came along, it was like daylight. All of a sudden, women were given the option of deciding for themselves what they would do about unwanted pregnancies. And you might ask, now, why do I feel so passionate about preserving that right? Well, I grew up knowing that my mother, as an unwed teenager, had become pregnant and had undergone an abortion by a doctor who was willing to carry out the procedure. Even though it was undergone by a doctor, she suffered a hemorrhage afterwards and had to go seek medical treatment. And it was not a happy time for her, of course. Maybe she was influenced to take that way out of her dilemma because her own mother, my grandmother, had been a unmarried teenager. And I will be happy to say that I broke that chain. I was well married before I ever got pregnant, but my grandmother, being a teenager in the very early 1900s, didn't have much of an option, carried the baby to term, and ultimately married a man a whole generation older than her in order to give that baby a father. And that marriage did not work out very well, even though my mother and her two siblings were a result of that marriage. It was not happy and resulted in separation ultimately, and my mother suffered for that. So maybe that's why she opted not to give birth to a child when she found herself pregnant. But having these examples in front of me, I was faced with the choice myself during my marriage to decide what to do about an unwanted pregnancy. And I made the decision that I would go seek an abortion at the Emma Goldman Clinic in Iowa City. Well, lucky for me, Mother Nature stepped in and solved my problem before I actually had to carry that out. But I would have done it, and I was so glad that I could go to a medical clinic and receive this treatment under the auspices of a legal procedure in a medical setting, that I wouldn't have to sneak around. Today, I see these rights, these privileges, things that should just be a matter of course for young women or women of any age, being restricted. It's like the pincers are closing back in with all of these new state laws that are restricting the right to receive an abortion, that Planned Parenthood clinics that are being shut down one after the other, so that in some states there's only one, and it imposes an extreme hardship on women who want to avail themselves of those services. And now some states are trying to pass fetal heartbeat laws, which means that women could wind up being prohibited from receiving an abortion before they even know they're pregnant. And that is not right. That is not right. I saw in the news the other night where they had found a baby wrapped in a plastic bag, abandoned by a roadside. That was in Georgia. And Georgia has just passed one of those super restrictive fetal heartbeat laws. It hasn't gone into effect yet, but I imagine that the chilling atmosphere in that state probably was a factor in the decision of the person who left that baby by the roadside. That decision was wrong, but I don't know the levels of desperation that drove that person to do it. But I do know that these are not easy decisions for any woman to make. And I don't think it's up to the state or legislators or anyone else to insert themselves into those decisions. So what I'm asking you all to do is to pay attention to what's going on in your state, in the state of Iowa, and take into consideration, do you really want to tell other people what they must do? Or would you rather have it left up to the person to decide for themselves? That's what I would prefer. So I ask you again to go out, pay attention when your state representatives are up for election. Ask questions, pay attention, and vote for people who give women the right of choice. And Toastmaster, or Mr. Toastmaster.
Fellow Toastmasters, Sandra, your speech on freedom of choice, here's my your speech on freedom of choice was engaging. It was difficult for me to evaluate in some ways, since I come down on the total opposite side of the spectrum as you. But I will say that there were a number of things that made it worth listening to. There were a number of things that made it a worthwhile speech in terms of just its production. And I would listen to you give it again. You did have a more serious demeanor than you usually do, but it was a serious topic. There's really, you don't want to have a whole lot of humor, I don't think, in that particular sort of topic. It won't diffuse things, it would just irritate people. Your gestures were minimal, but I noticed that you needed to balance yourself off the table today a bit more. And having a bum leg myself and having gone through physical therapy, I can understand the desire to grab onto something and hold on to it. It also, in some ways, helped in your production as far as more like a teacher than an orator in terms of giving things. You weren't giving a speech in some ways. You were sharing a story. Your introduction was short, but you made it very personal all the way from the beginning, but especially when you discussed your history of your own family. You were very clear, both in your diction and in your organization, on why you felt the way that you did. You didn't have as much dynamic change as normal, but I think that it was deliberate, again, for the reasonableness of the argument, that it was being formatted in that way. And it made it pleasant to hear, frankly. Probably better than somebody who was yelling and waving their arms and screaming in some way or other. If I was to have you change anything, it might be to show that you had an understanding of the opposing side. If you're going to give a speech like that, you have to at least give recognition to the validity of the other side. Otherwise, it's what happens all too often today, where you're talking into an echo chamber and you're not going to listen to anything. And I have a lot of friends that have very polarly opposite positions on me on both social and theological things, but we're still good friends because we can listen to one another and we recognize, whether we agree with it or not, the validity of the other side's position for them. You spoke with great aplomb. And I suspect that you would do that whether it was here, in a bar, or out in the street corner. That's just the way you are. And your speech coming from experience gave it all that much more credibility. Good speech on freedom of choice. Thank you.